Thank you very much for having me. I am an architectural historian, and so I'm going to talk about my current book project and research project. And the project follows architects and planners and construction companies from socialist Europe who worked in West Africa and the Middle East during the Cold War. So it's a very good combination with the preceding presentation. And in particular, I am interested in the ways in which these architectural trajectories were facilitated by multiple projects of global cooperation and solidarity, and quite often competing projects of collaboration and solidarity, with the focus on socialist internationalism and the non-aligned movement. So in what follows, I'm going to talk about two archives which were important for this project, which I have studied in their entirety, so as whole sets of data. And I'm going to talk about some of the tools which we have appropriated or developed in order to study these archives. The first archive is an actual archive, so really like a room with ordered documents at the Society of Polish Architects in Warsaw. And the other is a collection of documents which I have gathered from various repositories in Europe, in the Middle East, and in the United States. And that collection is focused on the development of the city of Baghdad, which is one of the case studies of this research. In fact, all of the case studies are focused on cities, which for me is a way to emphasize those multiplicity of networks rather than focusing on bilateral histories such as Soviet or Yugoslav or Polish export of architecture. And so to focus on cities, I look at cities as nodes of competing networks of architectural expertise. And these cities are Accra first, under Kwame Nkrumah, the capital of Ghana. So in the early 1960s, it is a really important country because it was there for the first time that the socialist model of development was translated into the tropical conditions. And this included a microrayon, or a housing neighborhood designed by a Soviet Design Institute and to be built with Soviet large-scale prefabrication technology, which was then for the first time adapted to tropical conditions. The second city is Lagos in Nigeria, where in the 1970s Hungarian, Bulgarian, and Yugoslav architects drew upon specific experiences of Central European architectural culture in order to address questions pertinent for decolonized West Africa, such as economic development and cultural emancipation. The third city is already mentioned, Baghdad, between the coup of Qasim in 1958 and the first Gulf War, with the master plan of Baghdad on the top left, which was delivered by a Polish state office in 1967. But also the development of Baghdad was influenced by Romanian, East German, Soviet, and Yugoslav architects contributing. These developments were very much facilitated by the specific instruments of foreign trade within the Comecon, such as barter, for instance. And finally, and perhaps most surprisingly, Abu Dhabi and Kuwait City in the last decade of the Cold War. And these buildings were all designed by Eastern European architects, and they testify to an increasing integration of actors from socialist countries into Western-led globalization of design and construction services by the end of the Cold War. So all these case studies were supported by archival research in public and private archives in 9 Eastern European countries, in 3 countries in the Middle East, and in 2 countries in West Africa. And I'm going to talk about 2 of them. So the first archive is the archive of the Polish Institute of Polish Society of Architects in Warsaw. And we looked at a very particular type of set of documents, namely dossiers of members of that society who applied for a professional distinction called the status of architect creator. And this distinction came with particular benefits in socialist Poland. So the applicants submitted a professional CV and a selection of their designs in order to demonstrate their creative labor. It was the focus of that submission was creative labor. And so it's a particular archive, it's a self-curated archive with an argument underlying the submission. It's an archive compiled by the protagonists. We have reviewed all applications in this archive and identified 574 dossiers, which included 2,485 designs for abroad between 1985 and 1989. And we have translated or transcribed this data, such as this, into a digital database. And I would like to show some visualizations of this database, which we used as a research tool. So not simply a presentation tool, but a research tool. And this is the first one. So we have applied social networks analysis software to this database in order to identify patterns of geographic deployment of architects abroad. So the nodes in this diagram represent individual architects, and the lines represent countries in which they worked. In other words, two nodes representing two architects are linked with a line representing a country if these two architects worked in that country at any period during the Cold War. And so, this diagram shows a couple of things. Most obviously, it shows the largest, it shows the countries in which the largest groups of architects from socialist Poland worked. And these biggest clouds are Libya, Algeria, Syria, and Iraq. But it also, the diagram is also useful in other ways because it shows that most architects concentrated their work in one country, and then there's a separate group of architects who transferred to another one, and this transfer typically happened between countries similar in geography or culture. But this diagram also can be used as a research tool because it allows to single out, if you like, the odd ones, the ones who do not fit into the clouds. And so, for instance, you can then zoom at a node like that and then go back to the archive and ask who was this person. In other words, and for example, this particular individual was a UN expert. And that is why his pattern of mobility is particular. So this diagram allows to develop a taxonomy of actors. This is a second diagram, which is based on the same archive, but it takes a different data to visualize them. Let me explain to you how it works. So on the vertical axis, you see the number of projects. On the horizontal axis, you see the number of countries in which these projects were located. And so, for instance, in 1958, there were 10 projects in 2 countries. And then in 1959, there were already 20 projects in 5 countries, right? And so we have mapped this information for every year and connected the dots. And this is what you get between 1958 and 1989. And I think this diagram is interesting because it allows to do what is in many ways a very fundamental job of a historian, namely to periodize. Because if you look, for instance, here, there is a clear period between 1958 and 1963, which is characterized by a geographic expansion, right, between 2 countries and 15 countries within 5 years, but within a limited number of projects. And then in the 1970s, you have a really crucial expansion in terms, really an explosion of the number of projects, up to 230 per year, but within a certain stable variable of countries. And in the 1980s, you have a decline. So I could talk a lot about what happens here and why it's the 1970s, but that's not the purpose of this talk today. What I want to show by this is that there is a particular visualization which allows to ask a number of questions to the archives. And now the second collection, if you like, it is now a collection of visual documents. It is a collection of maps master plans, military maps, and other type of visual documents focus on the city of Baghdad between the 1950s and today. And this is, these maps are not in the same place. We had to travel a lot to gather them, and they are from a number of repositories, starting with Baghdad, but then going through Moscow, Damascus, Warsaw, Belgrade, Boston, Washington, and London. So what I'm interested in these maps is really the question of the impact of the engagements of architects from socialist countries on the development of the capital of Iraq, and in particular the impact of the 1967 master plan of Baghdad, which is still the current master plan of the city. So, the plan which was delivered in 1967 and then revised in 1973 is still the general plan of the city. So what we did is we have redrawn all those maps, and we have georeferenced them by means of GIS software, so the Geographic Information System software. And the result of that you can see online if we connect. So we have published the result of this part of the research in this Middle Eastern journal called Jadaliyya. So you can browse that map on your own if you like. So what it shows is the 1967 master plan of the city, which is georeferenced onto the current plan of the city of Baghdad. And you can see the two main information of the master plan. So first the land use, here green spaces, commerce and so on, and second the transportation network. And you can see here all the categories, and you can browse through them and switch them on and off and compare with the current map. So we have done this digitalization work for all 8 maps, and based on this we also produced a number of analytical diagrams which respond to these questions of the impact of the master plan on the development of the city. And here are some examples. By comparing 2 maps, so the master plan and a Soviet military map from 1991, we were able, with quite a good precision and in a quantitative manner, to determine questions like the impact on the housing development in Baghdad of the master plan and on the transportation network. What we also did is we looked at architectural and urban design plans from the 1980s, and we have calculated the urban norms which were underlying these designs. So you know, the urban norms are those regulations which define how many kindergartens you need for a certain number of inhabitants, right? Or how many square meters of a park you need for a certain number of inhabitants. And in such a way, by calculating that back, we were able to see to what extent the urban norms proposed by the master plan were actually implemented in the city. And finally we also looked at the way in which the master plan impacted on the architectural culture of Baghdad. And here, for instance, we have looked at this Iraqi Czechoslovak building, if you like, a brutalist architecture in Rusafa, in a historical center of Baghdad, which in a very specific way interpreted the decisions concerning land use and transportation system of the master plan. So let me conclude. What this research shows is the scope of those engagements of architects and planners and construction companies from socialist countries abroad in a number of locations, and the impact on urbanization processes around the world. But what is probably more important for this conference is that what this research shows is that the Cold War was a radical multiplication of sites of knowledge production about urbanization processes, okay? And so this was evident in the case study of Baghdad, where we needed to look into several repositories on 3 continents in order to be able to demonstrate that development of the city. And this is a very, very different dynamics to the colonial dynamics, the dynamics of the previous period in the Middle East and West Africa, where the knowledge production about urbanization is very much focused on that duality between the colonial metropolis and to some extent the colony. By contrast, this research shows that crucial information was produced in Moscow, in Warsaw, in East Berlin, in Bucharest, in Belgrade, about places which I discuss today. And this multiplication of knowledge production and hence the multiplication of the archives in which this knowledge is stored is a really new phenomenon, and I do believe that it requires new tools. And that is why we have invested some time to develop such tools, and I have presented some of those to you today. Thank you.